what it's doing. You're just a nut job. You're a nut job, Tone.
One last thing, and I would love to hear what Jeff thinks about the price of Bitcoin. I haven't spoken to him in a little while. So, in my reply to Noriel, here's what I explained to him: the Nasdaq hit an all-time high in the year 2000. It did not breach that high until 2015. A lot of people don't know that. The Nasdaq was at its lows, almost at its lows, in 2009. You're telling me that the internet did not advance from 2000 to 2009? iPhone comes out in '07. Android comes out in '08. The Nasdaq is down 75% from its all-time high in 2009. It doesn't breach the all-time high till 2015. So by his logic, the internet was equally as useful in 2000 as in 2015.
Yeah, it's an interesting
And the
point.
internet was 75% more useful in 2000 than it was in 2009. Well, so sorry, internet was 75% less useful the other way around.
Yeah, it's amazing the difference. Dr. Jeff, good morning. We've been talking about bear markets. So this is your subject, man. Dr. Bear. Do you see bottom indicators, or is it just like you're still looking like it's a downward slope? What do you think, man?
Hey, well, first of all, Happy New Year, Alex and everybody. Good to see you. Tone, haven't seen you for a while. Hope you're all doing well and hope you had a good holiday season. Yeah, so here we are, first trading day of January. It still looks like more of the same to me. In fact, I still like talking about risk assets in general. Like, I still think here's what I look at kind of from a macro view, 30,000 foot view. We still have slowing economic growth. We still have disinflation from a high rate of inflation, and we still have a hawkish Fed. And when you have that combination of those three things, that's always terrible for risk assets, historically speaking, not always, but generally terrible for risk assets. I don't think Bitcoin, as you know, is a risk asset, but the majority of market participants still don't understand Bitcoin. They still think of it like a tech stock or a crypto. They still don't understand what it is. So it gets treated like a risk asset. So I do see lots of bottom indicators. I missed everything Tone said. I wish I would have been here for that. But when I look across on-chain analytics and when I look at kind of momentum indicators, especially longer term ones, everything looks to me like Bitcoin is in a bottom formation right now. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean it's the bottom. That means it's in the bottom region. And so you can have this kind of long slog that can last for many, many months, even a year possibly, where Bitcoin just sort of slogs along this bottom trend. Now, here's my outlook. I think last year, 2022, similar to 2018, was this period of kind of panic and disillusionment. You get like what Tone was talking about. You get texts from people basically mocking Bitcoin and saying it's failed because the price is way down. That's just nonsense, right? For those of us who see what's going on with Bitcoin, the network, it's never been stronger. Bitcoin hash rate is still near all-time highs. All of these factors say that the infrastructure of Bitcoin is just slowly and steadily being built out, and it's just on this just solid, steady state of upward trajectory. So relentless forward progression. So the price does what the price does because of, to me, of these massive macroeconomic conditions. I look at the business cycle kind of things, as you all know, and this could be wrong, and it'll change as the facts change. But as of today, I think it's most likely that we see a bottom in risk assets. And I think that Bitcoin, being the freest of all markets, I think it will sense these things first. So I look at, and I've said this before, sorry to repeat myself, but I look at Bitcoin, I look at US small cap stocks, and I actually look at kind of growth and tech stocks as well, which have just been absolutely decimated, even worse than Bitcoin, by the way. I think that those three things will be the first to perk up when it looks like we may be coming in a bust. So we go from these kind of high levels, this high CPI levels, to it rapidly goes lower to a low rate of disinflation or even deflation, negative year over year inflation growth. Is possible for a short time. I don't think it will stick. But then at that point, we'll be near the bottom, the definite bottom. And I think that whenever, and I'm sorry I'm talking so long, but I think that at the end, we're in this period of disinterest for Bitcoin. And it's always in the years of disinterest that the new bull market starts. So sometime this year, I think the Bitcoin the Bitcoin bear market ends and the new bull market starts, but it will be with very little fanfare.
a lot to digest. Happy 2023, buddy. So, thinking about that, like time frame wise, if we were to enter this period of big disinflation, maybe even deflation, you're thinking this year, next year?
No, this year. I'm looking at the stuff that I look at, business cycles and related things and how TA and things look for different risk assets. I think that probably the second quarter of this year. So, what is that? April, May, June, somewhere in that time frame. I like to use the Bitcoin conference in Miami as right around the bottom of Bitcoin and for risk assets. It could be sooner, it could be later, but based on what I'm looking at right now, that's when we'll see the actual bottom and kind of the business cycle. And then hopefully risk assets also should bottom a little bit before that.
All right. Any other kind of last thoughts on bear markets, bottom indicators, things like that, before we hit some announcements, and then we're approaching the top of the hour, so we're going to talk about Genesis block here pretty soon.
I mean, yeah, one thing I would say is that we still haven't had that capitulatory type event of the bear market where basically everybody panics and gives up and says, it's all going to zero. From past experience, past terrible recessionary bear markets. The last time we had one, by the way, was at the end of 2008 and 2009. Before that was the dot-com bust. By the way, one other thing I'd like to say. So first of all, I'm kind of waiting for that capitulation type event, which still hasn't happened yet. And then second, I will say that I do think we're in sort of a regime change or a paradigm shift, similar to what happened after the dot-com crash in 2000 to 2002. Is that at that point, the dot-com stocks had reached such incredibly high valuations. People thought we had reached basically a new normal where they were going to set this new standard and they were never going to go down again. Those kind of things. Same thing happened back in the late 60s with the Nifty 50 stocks. But I think we have a really similar setup to that in that I think that the growth, innovation, tech stocks in general are going to have a really rough decade. And I think we're going to sort of transition into a more of, hard assets are going to do well, value stocks are going to do well, companies that actually produce legit cash flows and are sort of recession proof and inflation proof a little bit more. They have pricing power. Those kind of companies, I think, do well this decade. I think even though I expect growth, tech, innovation stocks to rebound sharply when we do have this bottom, I don't think they're going to recover and go back to their amazing all-time highs that we saw in the last decade. That's just my personal experience. I think the Cathie Wood era is over, and I think the new value and hard asset era has begun.
So when you say final capitulation, do you have a definition of that in your mind, or are you just kind of like, when I see the event, I'll know it?
Yeah, it's like, you know it when you see it. It's when everybody's crying and yelling at you and your family's mocking you and you're getting texts telling you you're stupid because you recommended Bitcoin, and you see these huge red candles. And and the other thing to know is, even as a staunch Bitcoiner, it actually feels kind of bad to buy. Like, you're like, man, am I making the right decision? This is crazy how much this is crashing. It's that feeling. When you have that feeling, like even you question yourself a little bit, that's usually when we're hitting the capitulation, and we're very, very close to the bottom. In my experience, it doesn't always happen that way, but I think it's probably going to happen that way again this time.
Yeah, Jeff, add one more to the list. You have like a personal issue or like a business issue that forces you to sell a bunch of Bitcoins at the bottom, and that's exactly where the bottom is.
Love it. Yeah, great tone. Like when you get like margin called, those kind of things. When basically you thought you were doing pretty well, you had sufficient collateral, you had your ducks in a row, but then you realize suddenly, like in this just panic moment, that you don't. And even you are forced to sell.
Ways to go to get to the bottom. If my conviction and purchasing Bitcoin is.
Alex, do you have the topic on the list for today or maybe tomorrow? The whole like Barry Silbert and Genesis, and there was that letter to investors I haven't read yet, and something to do with Valkyrie. Is that on a topic for today or maybe tomorrow? Because I really would love to know more about that from experts in this group.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on talking about it today. We could do it tomorrow. I mean, that whole drama is kind of unfolding, and I I think we can save it if you want to write down some notes and your thoughts. Maybe if you're around tomorrow, we'll hit it.
All right,
Love to hear.
I'll try to catch up on that tonight.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Dylan's thoughts on that. He's in the audience. He rarely comes up here. He's very chill when he comes in here. But yeah, and also you, Jeff, obviously.
No, I'll just second what you said. Dylan and David Bailey are kind of at the forefront of what's going on over there, so I would definitely try to get them up if you can.
I don't know if Dylan likes me or not.
I don't think he likes you either. So.
I'm teasing, brother.
Just start talking about deadlifts.
Let's hit some announcements. You're listening to Cafe Bitcoin. Good morning and welcome. If you've never been here before, we do talk about Bitcoin. We talk about a lot of topics that intersect with Bitcoin. I mean, they range pretty widely. It may seem like at the moment we're not talking about anything that has to do with Bitcoin, but in some way or another, it usually does. It is also the place for your morning news. Preferred hangout for some of the smartest minds in the industry. Just chill, talk about what's going on. Sometimes they just drop in and listen. It is also a podcast up on Fountain, Spotify, and Apple. If you can't catch the live show, you can throw me or Swan a follow to be notified of when those drop. What else? Oh, Swan's got an app. Check it out. Download, install, and review. If you like it, I like it. Why? No shit coins. That's good. What else? Yeah, I work with Swan. Check it out. That's also a good thing. I'm not going to pump it any more than that. Okay. Today is the Genesis block day. It was mined on January 3rd, 2009 at 6:15 p.m. UTC or 1:15 p.m. East. I'm pulling a couple of factoids from Rizzo's excellent thread on this. So we know the exact date and time because the Genesis block actually contains a special timestamp for the operating system that Satoshi ran this on, which was Unix, apparently. The original Genesis block reward of 50 Bitcoin could not be spent. So basically, there was no pre-mine. I don't know if he did that intentionally. I suspect he did. Pre-mine is when a currency sets coins aside to reward its creators. Because if you have an issuer, then that starts to fall into the realm of a security. And one of the things about Bitcoin that makes it different than everything else out there is that it has no issuer. There's no pre-mine. Yeah, so he spent money on computing power to generate that first block, just like everybody else does. And then the other thing that was interesting about the Genesis block is that it included a newspaper headline from the UK, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. And because of that, we also know that it could not have been mined prior to January 3rd, because, obviously he would have had to be able to know the future if that was the case. And once again, $1 worth of Bitcoin back in 2009 is now worth $22 million. It's not too late. You can buy almost 6,000 sats for $1. Who has some input they want to share? I know Tomer probably has a ton of stuff to talk about in regards to the Genesis block.
Well, you're really putting me on the spot here. I just think this is it's a historic moment and will likely be remembered forever. For one, it's an immalleable history. Like that citation that you gave of Pete Rizzo's citation of what happened is true for all of us, and we can all verify it. It's indelibly carved into the blockchain, which any one of us can have any copy of, which is unerasable. Right? The amount of energy required, there's no way to modify the Genesis block itself, but even the second block would require all of the, and that's not possible either because of a checkpoint we put in at one point. But even if it were, you'd have to put into Bitcoin now all of the energy that has been put into it cumulatively over the entire last 14 years to try to roll back its history. So this is like this, as you call it, this impenetrable force field that requires just such an incredible amount of computation, energy, hardware to make any change to it. And so this is really the first block in the first chain of recorded human history that nobody can fuck with. And that's historic in and of itself. Like, we can all go back and look at the history of what took place in Bitcoin, on its chain at least, and all be in perfect agreement of what took place, and know mathematically, with mathematical precision and proof, that took place. So in a sense, it's like, it's the dawn. It's not the dawn of recorded history, but it's the dawn of recorded immalleable history, and that is itself a historic moment, if we just even think about it that way.
Jump in here, Tom.
Yeah, so I always had a slightly controversial view on this, which is not surprising, in that, like, to me, technology breaks through when it's time for that technology to break through. Like, I personally don't think that he timed it just perfectly with the financial crash. I honestly think it was more of a coincidence. And if Satoshi didn't develop Bitcoin right there, someone else would have done it within 6 months. It's kind of like calculus was invented by Newton and some other guy no one's heard of, because Newton made it to the patent office first. And so much technology just gets ASICs. The first ASIC was literally developed by two people within a couple of days of each other. So breakthrough technology usually happens when there's like enough historical, or like there is enough stuff that led to that breakthrough. And I think it was more of a coincidence, and he used it to his advantage by using the financial crisis as to help fuel it. But I think Bitcoin was happening that in 2009 regardless.
That's
I don't think
fascinating.
that's go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's how he chose to implement it, though. Like, I think a lot of other people wouldn't have invented it with a finite supply or a 4-year halving cycle or a couple of these other constants. Some of these constants about Bitcoin that made it so durable. Like, someone might have come up with one that had 1 minute block times or something, which wouldn't have scaled well, or someone might have come up with something. It's just, there is this really interesting thing about, I guess you just have to call it the wisdom or the foresight of Satoshi, that he chose these constants to the point where none of them have changed in the 14 years since he launched it, since it was this crazy invention without being tested, to now worth hundreds of billions of dollars and having whole industries spawn around and everything else. And we've got that saying, TikTok next block. There was just, again, for lack of any better word, this foresight or this wisdom to choose these values with the very long term in mind, right? 130-year issuance schedule, finite supply, but it'll take 130 years. It's just a very different way of looking at engineering than most people who develop and launch other things, with the presumption that they will be changed. And he was aware that he was launching it with this consensus algorithm that meant that many of these rules were written in stone and were unchangeable, because he wrote about that very early on. So he knew that he had to contemplate the long-term consequences of the immediate decisions that he was making. And I just don't know that necessarily someone else may have come up with this chain of signatures and issuances, and maybe even linking proof of work, but linking adjustable proof of work, that was a pretty big innovation. And then setting all these variables as they were. I just think it's such a magnificent achievement. Like, the planes we fly now are not like the planes the Wright brothers built. They changed a lot. But the Bitcoin we operate now is a lot like the Bitcoin that Satoshi released. A heck of a lot like it.
Tomer, do you think it's fair to say that Bitcoin wouldn't work the way it does if those values were different?
It's really like, nobody has this parallel universe, but I think to say, oh, well, if he had made the block times 3 minutes, this is when it would have broken, or how it would have broken, or if he'd had all the coins pre-issued, it wouldn't have caught on, or if he issued them on a linear basis rather than an exponentially declining basis, it wouldn't have created so much excitement around the halvings, which rejuvenates things. So there's a lot of unknowns, but
yeah, well, we've debated this topic. It's actually an interesting topic to debate. I think it would have still succeeded. Oh, maybe not the 3-minute part, but that was a technological thing that he knew. But the economic side of it is interesting. Jimmy Song and I debated this, and his argument was that, well, if Satoshi would have made it as a finite supply, there would have been a soft fork to limit the supply to make it finite. If Satoshi did, infinite supply, there could have been a soft fork to make it finite. And my argument was that soft fork would not have succeeded. So we're lucky that Satoshi created it with a finite supply, and we're lucky that that was his view on economics when he built it and released it. Because to me, the most important properties of Bitcoin is unconfiscatability and censorship resistance. The finite supply is a distant third that does help drive the price, but it's not what the essence of Bitcoin really is. So if Satoshi did not give it a finite supply, I still think that would have been the Bitcoin we're using, and a shitcoin with a finite supply would not have surpassed it, and it would have been incredibly challenging to soft fork it or hard fork it into a finite supply.
Go ahead, Wicked.
I mean, I would argue that the finite supply was something that was very much on the forethought of Satoshi and was part of what Bitcoin was, right? I mean, when he first released it, that was like one of the very first things he talked about in his release of version, 0.1. Talks about there being only 21 million Bitcoin. And I think that was like part of the selling point, was that it was fixed in supply. Right, because early on, I don't know if people were really thinking about the censorship resistance so much as like the fact that we just had a bunch of fucking blown up banks that were blowing up because of all the rehypothecation and bullshit, and so I think that was probably on the forethought of everyone's minds who were the early adopters. Don't you think?
Right, no, and I agree with that. But the real innovation here is censorship resistant data transfer. And that's why I'm saying we're lucky it was Satoshi that discovered it and not somebody else, because I think 90% of the people that would have discovered this within 6 months of him would not have done it with a finite supply.
Okay, got it. We're in agreement. Okay.
Yeah. I would say I agree with you, Tone, and because Bitcoin was the discovery of censorship resistance in money, and it was the discovery of digital scarcity, and it was a discovery of immalleable record keeping, and it was the integration of energy into money. Right? There's probably I could probably sit here and contemplate 5 or 6 more things that it was the discovery of all at once, and it was discovered by someone who kept their identity secret and knew to do it before they released it. And it was the discovery of someone who, in recognizing the importance of doing it, left behind their fortune. So that there's so much that goes into the discovery of Bitcoin, that to distill it and creation of Bitcoin and launch of it and the whole thing and how Satoshi did it, that it is that for me to try to boil it down to one most important thing kind of strips away part of its magnificence, because it's so magnificent because it was more than just the one thing. Whichever one is more important to, digital scarcity is more important to some people than censorship resistance. And at the end of the day, we'll find out that all of these things were equally important, as important as the fact that we don't know who Satoshi is and that he never spent his coins and disappeared, leaving the whole thing behind truly decentralized, right? How lucky are we that the person who discovered this actually understood what decentralization meant and didn't step up and try to take control of it and stay in control of it. That might be the most important thing. So these things are all so super important, and the invention is so extraordinary for that, that it was the invention of so many things, or the execution of so many things that previously didn't exist all at once, without trial and error. Just on the first go, here you go.
It reminds me of, Tomer, is you guys have heard these stories of, I want to say it was like Mozart. There's other examples where people will wake up and they will have had a dream or something, and then they'll have a blueprint for something that's like perfect in its entirety, but it's incredibly complex, but it's still perfect. and then they'll just like write it all out like a symphony all at once, or a novel all at once, or some kind of blueprint or design in engineering that's just like, it's like, I don't know what the
Yeah,
right word is, but it's like
yeah. Like
divinely perfect
I mean,
all
it
at the
is
same time.
when you think about this. Like Satoshi didn't raise money and didn't have backers and didn't have a whole bunch of people saying, "Yeah, keep going, don't give up, you can do it." Like he did it all in secret, and then released it out of nowhere, right? There were apparently, a couple of emails that he sent to a few people as Satoshi, asking questions about stuff, but people didn't give him much in the way of the time of day. Like he woke up inspired at some point to do this with, perhaps as you describe, Alex, with the vision of how to put these pieces together. And there were people who'd written a lot about how to do this, but he was like, "Ah, damn it, I'm going to do it. I'm gonna build this decentralized thing," and figured it all out, and just kept going at it, and then put it out. And it's for those of us who study the history of it, time and again we just get blown away. Like, wow, how did he know to make this choice? How did he know to make that choice? How did he have the humility to not come out of from behind the curtain and say, "No, I'm Iron Man," right? I'm Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah.
Like to put the invention ahead of himself, so much so that all the power, all the money, all the fame associated with it, 14 years on now, right? It's so likely forever, was part of the price that he paid for creating this thing. And that's something that even like we just don't know other people in the modern era, and we're talking about like thousands of years, who took no credit for what they did, because it was crucial that they take no credit for what they did. There may not be another invention that had as a crucial requirement of it that the creator not take credit for what they did.
Yeah. And how much character and self discipline would it take? Right? Like Satoshi's like the idea of what his coins might be worth today, or it's in the billions, is it not?
Oh yeah, like it's people estimate that it's over 1 million coins that he mined before this thing caught on. So he was just running his computer, and that remain untouched and unmoved. So you do 1 million times 16,000, that's 16 billion. Uh, it, that's a lot of money, and and he's on it. It's the biggest pile of Bitcoin in the world, as I wrote in one article. If Bitcoin becomes all the money in the world, it'll be the biggest pile of money in the world, Satoshi's coins, and everyone can see it, and nobody can touch it. And so it becomes this untouchable but fully observable monument to the creation of Bitcoin, and his discipline to not touch it, and his discipline to create it in the way that he did. It's really remarkable.
Wicked, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I believe Satoshi will probably be the first individual to have the USD wealth of $1 trillion. I would imagine he'll probably be the first. So that'll be interesting.
Oh, interesting point. Peter.
So I wanted to say that, I think that everybody has, when they have a need or necessity for one or many of the properties of Bitcoin, that they purchase BTC, they get interest, and that's when they start to go down the rabbit hole. And I think that whatever that initial spark was for the individual is something that they are going to be biased towards as far as a property goes, and they may think that that is the most important property. And Tomer, I really love how Tomer has been, and I'm really curious to know what it was that drew you, Tomer. What was that initial property? What was it that you saw? And the fact that you've been able to go down the rabbit hole and now can step back, I'm assuming can step back and say, wow, this thing it's in its totality, is such an amazing discovery. And for me personally, I think it's that it embodies liberty, which is kind of beyond the scope of the actual technical protocol itself. And I think that's one of the things that is so amazing about Bitcoin, is how it really goes beyond the tool that it is, and just it just seeps into the social fabric as a whole, and really is a positive influence in our world.
Yeah. If I can answer your question for you, I think because it was the easiest thing to understand, the fixed supply was the first thing that drew me in from an understanding perspective. Like I was introduced to Bitcoin. I read the white paper. I knew I wanted to understand how this proof of work thing worked and how digital signatures work, but I didn't yet. But I could understand the simple algorithm of there's 50 coins per block, and it gets halved every 210,000 blocks, and that leads to a sum, a convergence of 21 million coins. So that made sense to me. And I was in private equity at the time, so I was always evaluating companies. And I just remember, I used to joke with people that would come in and pitch me their company and say, "What do you think it's worth?" off of like a 10-page PowerPoint. And I'd say, "Well, somewhere between zero and all the money in the world." And they would be disappointed, but some might appreciate that I didn't have enough knowledge to know what their company would be worth. But I looked at this thing and I was like, oh my God, this actually is going to be something like either zero or all the money in the world. And then you do the math and you just say, well, what's all the money in the world divided by 21 million? And it's like, oh my God, there's more than 21 million houses. One of these coins is worth more than a house, and they're selling for $650 or something at the time. Like that seems really strange. This is very early. So that was the easiest part to understand. And then wanting to find sources of information to understand cryptography or understand what a hash function was or all these other things, that came with time, but that required study. So I do think that's one of the perhaps most important features of the digital scarcity, is how it acts as an enticement, an allure to say, look, you can understand that this thing could be worth a lot of money. Why don't you come and learn why that's enforceable, or how that's enforceable, or what it has to do with freedom and other things. And that all starts to come later.
I don't know who's next. I think
Yeah.
Jim. Good morning, Jim.
Go ahead.
Good morning, guys. This is a interesting discussion. I've been listening all morning.
Can't hear you, brother.
I understand what I was looking at. It took me 6 months before I can understand the significance, and that was based on a statement by a woman in a TED Talk who said, you can trust the system without trusting the people who are involved with it or who are running it. And that was a very interesting and unusual concept for my brain, and I needed to figure out what she meant by that. How could I trust a system that's built and run by humans, but I don't need to trust any of the humans that are involved in it? And the picture that I developed in my mind eventually was one where I think Satoshi had a broad enough perspective of the world. He was a cypherpunk. He understood that people were trying to make digital money. I think he understood the main concept about a monetary system, that if one group of people or one entity can control the supply of that money, everybody else is controlled by that entity. All money at its most basic level is a ledger, essentially who owns what value. And we've kept track of the value of different types of money through human history by somebody, saying, yeah, you own this and you own that. Essentially, what we have now in the fiat system is banks and other institutions tell everybody how much money they have, and of course they can make as much as they want. And I think Satoshi recognized that we needed a ledger that could be appended by anybody in a trustable way, that everybody else was okay with that appending of the ledger and would be willing to update their own copy of it. And I think he saw this vision of an electronic digital system that was self-contained. Essentially, Bitcoin is a self-contained system. Every node on the network has the same copy of that ledger. And each node can trust the copy of that ledger because of the way it was built. The idea that anybody could append the ledger and we would all be able to trust the person asking to append the ledger because they've done what we call proof of work. They've spent electricity, they followed the rules, and everything fits into this protocol. And so when somebody appends this ledger, everybody else can sit back and go, totally cool. I don't know that guy, but he did it right. And my copy gets changed just like everybody else's copy. And so the world has the same copy every 10 minutes, roughly updated, of who owns what within this system, just within this system. That it doesn't have to be worth anything. These digital files that are born help increase the likelihood that humans will actually adopt this thing as a ledger for monetary transfer. But in the beginning, it was very easy to break. It was very easy to co-opt. And I think he saw that it needed to grow to a point where it could be left on its own. I almost wonder if he left earlier than he might have wanted to, simply to make it have the hardest test possible to survive. The leader left it in charge of another person who wasn't necessarily the best leader, but Bitcoin survived. And that's kind of amazing. And it's kind of a testament to the fact that enough smart people saw that bigger picture and did what they needed to do to make sure that nobody could break this thing, that people joined and kept it going. And everything we've seen over the past 14 years that's developed is an outflow of the uniqueness and the significance of what was discovered and built, and by enough smart people seeing it, agreeing to it, and saying, let's work with this thing, let's make it happen. And we are the beneficiaries of those early visionaries. We have then become visionaries ourselves in the sense that we are all here to help make sure this thing does not die. Not that any of us could kill it, but we're here to help people understand why it won't die and why you should value these things and why the world is a better place if we have this as our system of money versus the one that's already corrupted because some people can control the units and the ledger. So it took me a while to see that bigger picture. I simply wanted to articulate that for anybody who may have had difficulty in visualizing, what this thing really is. Maybe my vision of what it is and my articulation of it might help somebody else focus or get a better, clearer picture of what Bitcoin is for them, why it's so relevant to this world and everything else. And I just love this space. You guys are awesome. I appreciate being able to come here and listen every day and put in my 2 cents when I feel like I got something to say. So thank you very, very much for having me, guys.
One thing I was just going to point out real quick, which I think is interesting. So talking about kind of when Satoshi left and his enormous amount of Bitcoin that he has and that's never moved since, it's actually kind of interesting to think about how much it was worth when he left, because presumably, that's kind of the last chance he had to spend it, assuming he left this world, right? Which some people think he may have. And looking at the price on that day, now correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time that he was heard from, at least in the on the internet, was December 13th of 2010. Is that right, Tomer? Do you know if that date is right? I believe that's right.
I don't know for certain, but it's
So I think it's December 2010. Anyways, the price was around a quarter, 25 cents per Bitcoin. So if you multiply that out by, it's estimated that he has about 1.1 million coins. That's only a value of $250,000. I mean, that's a lot of money, but it's not nearly as crazy of a value as it's worth now, right? So he walked away without having spent any of those Bitcoin when they were valued altogether at about $250,000. I don't know. I mean, I just thought it was kind of an interesting point to bring up. I don't know if it's relevant to anything, but it's just kind of interesting. It's not like he never spent billions and billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. He just never spent a couple $100,000 worth. So just to kind of, throw a wrench in your folklore a little bit there.
Oh, no, you don't think he would have done the math of what this could be worth? I mean, Hal Finney had done the math for him, so I don't think he walked away because he had given up hope on the price of Bitcoin. Pete Rizzo has done a couple of years ago, I think. He wrote a really lengthy piece on December 13th around why he thought Satoshi left, or the last days. I think it's called like the last days of Satoshi Nakamoto. And he was talking about how there was pressure to get him to leave because people were taking it over and all this kind of stuff. So I think Pete's done a really good job of it. As far as the historic record shows, and there's nothing you can do to damage my take on the folklore of it. Like, this person, whether it was $200,000 or $250 billion, maintained their anonymity throughout and didn't spend the coins because they didn't want to damage the value of the project. Like, this was a work to create the project and put it out into the world, like a work of art. It wasn't a work to make money. He didn't do it to make money for himself. Interestingly enough, he made money. He created money, but he didn't do it for riches. And there's no question in my mind that that's the case. Like, all the evidence, without a single exception, points to that.
Do you think, I haven't read that piece yet, so I'll look it up. It sounds like an interesting read. Did Rizzo, or do you think that he left because Bitcoin's adoption actually happens faster than he anticipated, and it kind of spooked him a little bit, just how quickly things were accelerating?
Well, there is a lot of speculation. There's concern that Gavin Andreessen was summoned by the CIA to do a presentation. There was concern that money was being donated to WikiLeaks. And at one point, using an interesting metaphor, Satoshi said, "We've gone and kicked the hornet's nest right now." And so Satoshi may have been concerned that now this project was more than just a hobby thing, and that his identity was now at risk of being revealed, and that was the reason for him to disappear. That we can't really know. That he had the vision to know enough in advance to say, both the vision and the ability to obscure his identity so that his identity was never revealed. And he had to obscure his identity not just to his enemies, but also to his friends, because his friends would then be compromised. So in this whole time that he did this, Satoshi never had anybody put their arm on their shoulder and say, "Good job, buddy." And like, he had to hide out from everybody in the world. And so he must have always been watching his back, and always paranoid about making some mistake that would reveal his identity, and then the whole jig would be up. So like, that's a level of concern that's just as important as the level of concern for crushing bugs and not having holes in the software that was malleable. Like, another attack surface was Satoshi himself.
That's potentially the greatest attack surface.
Right.
You look at anything that has been tried like this before. It's always been, can they find the one guy? Can they find the guy, or they find the servers? All that. The decentralized part of it, like somebody was saying before, that we all come to this thing from our own kind of perspective as to what is the most important thing. They're all important, but we all have those things. Like, decentralization was a huge thing to me, because I always thought that the biggest threat to Bitcoin was the United States government. And if that's true, I don't know if it is or not, but if it is, then Satoshi was pretty damn smart to be paranoid, I'm thinking. All right, we got Fish Bernoulli. Good morning.
Hey, there was, related to the conversation before, about the mathematical choices and the foresight. There's one really interesting thing, a realization I had. A lot of it seems like foresight, but I always wondered what really, defined the 21 million and how that final supply came to be. And then I realized that, at the end of each halving epoch, the percentage of supply that's left is, for example, at the first halving, 50% of the supply was left. And for the duration of that epoch, it was a 50 Bitcoin reward. And then at the end of the next halving period, it was all a 25 Bitcoin reward, and there was 25% of the supply left, and so on. And I think that's what actually converges on that. It's asymptotic to 21 million. It's kind of
that can't be a coincidence, right? Like, that was, he could, because if he had chosen 100 as the initial block reward, then still 50% would have been mined after the first 210,000 blocks.
Right.
And if he had chosen 25, then still 50%. So he chose 50 to map. Like, he had created the algorithm first, it would seem, and then he said, well, what's the right number to pick? Well, let's pick a number that's symbolic of what gets issued in that epoch. So I'll pick 50, and that's what then led to, after he had chosen the 210,000 blocks, which came after, which was this 4-year arbitrary selection, like as often as the Olympics or as often as a leap year, for whatever reason, 4 years and 10 minute
election,
or presidential elections, right? Like, these 4-year cycles seem to make sense for a number of things. So he chose the 4 years. He chose the 10-minute blocks. That got to 210,000 blocks times 50% being issued in the first epoch leads to 21 million coins. And that's where we got the 21 million from.
Yeah, I've always wondered about the 21 million and the 210,000 blocks. I don't know. There's just a lot of really interesting mathematical harmony there.
Yeah, I know some people who talk about the powers of threes, and this was also something that Nikola Tesla was excited about: 3, 6s, and 9s, and digital threes. And I never really understood that, but there's a lot of harmony in these numbers that Satoshi chose. It's hard to dispute that.
It's another interesting just statistic. I just looked it up. When Satoshi disappeared on December 13th, 2010, his total balance, so assuming that it was about a 1.1 million, accounted for roughly 22.5% of the total mined supply at the time. So at that time of his disappearance, he still owned just a massive amount of the available mined supply. I don't know. Again, like maybe irrelevant, but just an interesting
in
statistic.
Bitcoin terms. In Bitcoin terms, this does not hold true if it's Ethereum, right?
What are you talking about? Who's talking about Ethereum?
No, I'm talking about the free mine. I'm talking about the free mine. They were like 70% free mine on Ethereum. That was sarcasm.
Yep, that was sarcasm.
That was low.
And its ability to work going forward. This is the first time that I've heard discussion of Satoshi's disappearance being part of a way to avoid an attack vector, though it makes sense. And I was under the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, I was under the impression that there was a time when it would have been easy for Bitcoin to be snuffed out. That time passed through adoption and network effect, and is no longer. I don't know that it's not possible to destroy Bitcoin at this point, but it is certainly much more difficult than it was at that time. And I'm curious, my question is now back to Satoshi's disappearance. Do some of the people on the stage here think that had he not disappeared, that it would have been more noticeable for a governmental agency or a state actor or a large actor to come in and recognize the threat that Bitcoin is to state issued money? Or are these kind of not necessarily binary things?
I think that that's a fair theory. When something has a leader, it tends to look more threatening, maybe to a state. And so if it has a central point that they can target or that they can, put pressure on, then maybe they'll pursue that in a more meaningful way. And so again, going back to these like interesting statistics, when he did disappear, there was only 23% of all the Bitcoin had been mined. So there was still 76% left to be mined if any state had come in with a bunch of hash power at that point in time, they could have amassed a very, very large amount of Bitcoin and probably had a lot more influence on the future outcome of the network, just having such a large amount of it. But because none of them took it seriously, and maybe that was in part because Satoshi left, none of them started mining that early, right? None of them actually considered adopting it or anything like that back when they could have amassed such a large amount. And now here we are 14 years late. Well, not since he disappeared, but here we are 14 years after its initial release. And, there's only one or two countries who are mining it officially. And they have, a fraction of a percent of the total supply. And there's only 9% left. It's just like, it's too late for any of them to get a super large amount. But, that's the benefit of Bitcoin. I mean, it kind of snuck under their noses and became distributed without any of them realizing just how impactful it would be in the future. And thank God it did. Right.
This is reminding me of where the story you told of that sort of lecture at MIT with Jason Lowry.
Yep.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. Do you want to recap that for people who didn't hear the story? I thought it was really good, and I still think about it.
Yeah, I think about it pretty often as well. I still need to have a one-on-one with him just to kind of weed out some of the details, because I want to ask him about some of the more details of it. But long story short, I went to his thesis presentation at MIT. He presented it to the Bitcoin Club. They meet weekly. I don't go to this meeting or whatever, but Jason invited me to the specific one, so I showed up. And they asked, "What do you want us to do about it? You want us to just buy half the Bitcoin?" And Jason said, "No, it's too late for that. You can't do that, right? 90% of it's already been mined. There's only 8% left to be mined, and the rest of it has been distributed mostly amongst very hardened hodlers who aren't going to just give it up for dollars, right? So you're I'm here to tell you that you've already lost the war, and I'm here to help you negotiate your terms of surrender," is what he told us. He told them. So yeah, and a pretty amazing thing to tell the White House, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true. We're going based on what he told us. He told them, but still, it's pretty
I'm
crazy to think
imagining a
that it could have
field of the
happened.
Wicked. I'm imagining a little field of the mushrooms that go poof, and each one of those heads that he was talking to just going poof, poof, poof.
Yeah, and I mean, and here's the thing, any country who surrenders to Bitcoin and adopts it and kind of stops with their fiat madness, right? Like just puts a cap on that really stupid way of dealing with their money, right? I mean, because fiat, it gives control to the governments, but only for so long until it blows up, and then they lose everything. And this is kind of just, I feel like they know it, right? They know it. They know
Oh,
that
they
eventually it
definitely
will
know
end.
it. They definitely know it. I mean, if you look at sort of the coordinated efforts of what a lot of them are trying to do right now, my opinion, they're desperately trying to figure out a pathway forward where they retain control. And
Right. And
I just don't know how that's going to happen.
well, I mean, I think basically what Jason's trying to do is he's trying to convince the government that if they pivot and surrender to Bitcoin and adopt it earlier than everyone else, then they'll have, at least from a nation state perspective, they'll have an amazing advantage over all of their nation states. Now, if Russia or China does it first, they're going to have the advantage. So I think Jason, being kind of a military guy and thinking about these strategic advantages and these Schelling points, he's just very concerned about what an outcome could be in a world where Russia or China or some other adversary adopts Bitcoin first. He's just trying to convince our government to do it earlier because he knows
What's the
that.
risk? Like, I know maybe, I mean, I know this is not your thesis, but you've spoken more, I think, to the guy than probably anybody up here right now. Um, what is the risk? Like, what if China embraces it, or Russia embraces it, or some other potentially not friendly nation to the United States of America? What does that mean from a strategic defense perspective?
I'm actually not entirely sure what his thesis is in terms of the outcome of the United States not adopting it first. I imagine that any nation who has more wealth than another always has a strategic advantage, right? I mean, if we're going back to the days when nations had stockpiles of gold, and that gold was a function of how long they could endure a war, then obviously having more gold
Total war.
was a strategic advantage.
Yeah.
And now we fund wars with printed money, but that will only last for so long, right? If Russia or China or both of them or some conglomerate of nations decide, hey, we're going to start using Bitcoin as our base layer money, maybe we'll back our currency with it, or maybe we'll just fully adopt it, and we're not going to accept anything other than Bitcoin for any of our exports. If they've got a lot more Bitcoin than everyone else, then when everyone else has to rush to get Bitcoin in order to buy things from them, then whatever stockpiles they had had before that announcement will increase in value significantly, and they'll just have an advantage just from a like a national stockpile or of money type of. I mean, I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does, but the thing that I wonder about is that the whole thing about human beings are going to do generally what's in their best interest. So if you're someone who's at the upper echelons of American politics, for example, the Cantillon effect is a very big part of your life because I mean these people get trillions of dollars to spend, you know, and that's because of the money printer. And so they're obviously incentivized to try and extend the life of that particular. Everybody has to work for it now. You're walking into a room full of people who are used to basically getting everything essentially for free on everybody else's dime. They're super privileged, they're super powerful, they get trillions of dollars a year to spend. And there's a guy basically saying, hey, this is all coming to an end. You need to choose whether you want the United States of America to matter strategically moving forward, or if you're just going to keep playing this game, essentially. How's that supposed to go down? That's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, who knows? I wonder if there's some way to measure kind of the effectiveness of the Cantillon effect. I wonder if over time, as fiat has kind of devolved, if the Cantillon effect has had diminishing returns, right? Is it not as effective as it was in the beginning? Or is it more effective? I don't know. I mean, I really don't really,
Well,
I really don't know, but
if you study the history of currencies, right, like through their lifespan, like the Cantillon effect continues to benefit those closest to it right up until the hyperinflation. At which point, it's the people who figure it out first and convert to the assets that retain the value through the hyperinflation. The all the wealth transfers to them. So the question becomes, did they figure that out or not? And if they don't, like, history shows that those people become completely wiped out. They lose all their wealth if they don't figure it out in time.
yeah. And so, I mean, you can imagine from a nation state perspective, um, like if we don't have wealth preserved in assets, then do we get wiped out as a nation state? I mean, if the government can't afford to pay its army anymore or the military anymore because we don't have, I mean, what are they going to pay them in the gold that's at Fort Knox? No. And if the military people stop accepting dollars, they say, yeah, fuck that, it's worthless, it's hyperinflated. Then I mean, then what? So maybe that's the Schelling point. Is like you need to have the money of the future, whatever that may be, and it's becoming pretty clear, at least to me and to I would say most folks up here on stage and to Jason, that that's going to be Bitcoin. And he's just, it's his job to convince his the people he reports to that this could be a really big threat vector to the United States if they can't afford to pay their military.
Yeah, I'm going to make one last comment on that because I agree in that if you look at also, this is from history. I can't think of a single time where you didn't have a major cultural reset that also was a financial reset, whereas exactly what you're talking about, Wicked, is exactly what happened. You know, they debase the currency, the economic system blows up, they stop paying the troops just quit, basically. Like, we're done. And that's the end of the empire. And this happened in Rome. This happened in the former USSR. I mean, there's so many examples of this throughout history. I'm gonna leave it at that and welcome up Paul Tarantino because I'm guessing, Paul, you had something you wanted to add. Good morning, happy 2023.
Yeah, happy 2023. I hope you guys all had a great holiday. I think what Jason is doing is really, really interesting. I know he triggers a lot of people, but um, I think it's really important. And, you know, the military is both offensive and defensive. And when you think about the future of warfare and cyber warfare, I think Bitcoin becomes a very critical piece to our defense strategy. You know, if we have enemies that are attacking our electrical grid and that's impacting our ability to transact financially, it becomes important to have a highly resilient money and a highly resilient internet. And I know he's focused a lot on defense from space and in the satellite world. So I feel like he's on to something that's really important. I also feel like you know, if the dollar, if you run enough war games and you anticipate that the dollar is going to lose its reserve currency even in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, then you would want to take a defensive position into what could be the currency of the future. So I agree with all this stuff, and I think what he's doing is really, really important. And I would just encourage people to look beyond uh, the words of war because I think a strong adoption of Bitcoin as a protocol and as of a money is going to have a limiting impact or a dampening impact on war efforts in the future. So that's it. Happy 2023, and let's effing go.
So maybe that brings us a world that's just much more peaceful moving forward. I mean, that's my hope.
Yep, we can hope.
Isn't the
Peaceful.
definition of war changing though? I mean, aren't we going away from a kinetic idea of warfare? I mean, that's when we say war. When I hear war, that's what I think. But I think that in the future, war is going to look different. It's not going to be. It might be as damaging, but it's not going to be such a kinetic physical thing.
Well, Peter, that's a pendulum that's been swinging for 10, 15 years already. You know, there's this concept called full spectrum warfare that involves not just kinetic, but economic, cyber, psychological information, all of the above. And now there's, you know, there's new battlefront. Space is probably the most important battlefront we have right now. So yeah. And this has been going on for a long time already. I would suggest that when I say we, I mean the United States of America has already been engaged in cyber and financial warfare for at least the last decade, if not longer. It's already been happening. I mean, to the point that Paul was saying, if we move into a world where you actually have to work to create money, you don't just wave a magic wand and it's kind of like hand wavy, and the next thing you know, you've got, you know, $1.7 trillion worth of omnibus spending bill. It just, even that still blows my mind. But I mean, you have an $850 billion a year budget of money that's created out of thin air to fund the United States military. I mean, does that go away? I don't know. But like, I'm not convinced it's good.
Another way to look at that is that you know, the first mover, if the U.S. became the first mover to adopt Bitcoin as real money, it is going to increase the cost of war for every enemy of our state as we drive the price of Bitcoin up through accumulation.
Yeah, that's a fair point, especially if you start to reach. Well, to me, the one of the most interesting aspects of Bitcoin is that it's kind of its conversion between energy and money. Like to me, it's the most perfect energy arbitrage the human race has ever seen. Some people don't get that, and I know it freaks a lot of physicists out. Um, think of it as potential energy. Is one way to think of it. I think that's how some people grok it. Finally, is that there's a thing called potential energy, which is basically energy at rest. It's not in motion yet, but it's stored up, ready to go. That's the way I look at money. It's the way I've always looked at money. I thought that was obvious to people, you know, and I'm learning recently that physicists, it's not obvious to them that money is a store of energy because of the way that they understand energy. But yeah, absolutely. If that price gets driven up in US dollar terms and it's a reflection, if it becomes a reflection of the actual cost of energy in the world, then yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think of it also. I mean, you look at our strategic oil reserves. You could have a strategic Bitcoin reserve as well. You know, and it's the same idea, is that you're preserving energy for a future need when production or availability is limited.
I think the other part of Jason's thesis is that Bitcoin itself may become a very sought after resource when it comes to cybersecurity. So you might actually need Bitcoin in order to, uh, you know, execute certain tasks. You know, like I don't know, you know, like execute tasks online or whatever, right? Like basically the idea of kind of Adam Back's idea with Hashcash, where you're using that token to actually send an email, but then scaled up to, like, you know, cybersecurity on a nation state level if they were to attach the necessity of Bitcoin in order to actually execute commands, and then Bitcoin becomes a resource that you need stockpiles of in order to, you know, keep your cybersecurity fully. So I think that's also another part of his thesis. And that's one part that I want to weed out a bit. You know, he didn't touch on it too much during his talk, and I want to kind of press him a bit more on that idea, because I thought it was an interesting one, but not one I'm fully convinced about myself.
Old fashioned BTC. Good morning, man. You got something you want to add here?
Hey, cheers, everyone. Can you hear me good?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just commenting. I'm reading this book called Stealth Wars. It's been a while since I've been up here, so cheers. Happy New Year to everybody. Keep stacking. About the CCP and their unrelenting warfare, unrestricted warfare. It's, you guys were talking about the evolution of warfare. And I think that's kind of where we get in the mud, is the war, you know, warfare going forward will be changed. That, you know, economic attack, you know, Bitcoin can free their people from their capture that China has, and profits from the U.S. that are captured inside of mainland China. You know, I just think Bitcoin, people might think of it as a weapon, but I think it'll be the tool that frees all of humanity, you know, in that spectrum, and gives people the ability to transact without restriction. But also, as we grow, capturing nation states that do capture more mining capacity, more Bitcoin, you're right, economically, we'll have more power. And I think that's the thesis of the 50-year plan the CCP has, is to take over every industry and do it more cheap, you know, because they use the slave labor and things like that, and then put our businesses out of business, take our jobs and things. I think Bitcoin could pop the bubble that allows people to capture these industries and things like that, hopefully, and freeing us all over the world to make the playing field a little bit more level. So that's kind of the positive impact I see coming out of it. But it could, you know, be wielded, or possibly tried, an attempt to be wielded by other nation states to weaken our power on the global stage. But when we talk about war, you know, I think when we're discussing that, it's like, you know, a different type as we go forward, non-kinetic. But just wanted to add that. Happy New Year's to everybody. It's been a while. I hope you're all doing great. Let's keep stacking. Let's keep plugging away, and let's keep fighting for freedom. Cheers.
Cheers, brother. Thanks for coming up. All right, we're pretty much close to the end of the show here. Does anybody have any final comments they want to make in regards to Genesis Block Day and all of the different things that makes Bitcoin unique? Decentralized, finite supply, global instant transfer of any amount to the other side of the planet, basically instantly, with no gatekeepers, unconfiscatable for some, unchangeable for others. These are all the things that different people have different reasons why they come to Bitcoin, but these are all the things. Any closing thought?
Oh, I'll just say, up in the nest, I guess it's the second item from the last. I've shared the most popular article I've ever written on Bitcoin, which is called The Legendary Treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto, which I think, for me, sums up my nearly 10-year journey through Bitcoin. And I know people have really enjoyed it. So for anyone in the crowd who hasn't read it yet, and there's also an audio version in the tweet right below that one, if you click on it, read by Guy Swan. I know people enjoy it, and this is a nice day of the year to review what Satoshi accomplished and what that might mean, what that tends to mean to people, and a little speculative story at the end of what his coins represent.
Yeah, this is an important day. Genesis Block Day is a chance for all of us to reflect and recognize that the old world is dead. A lot of people haven't realized that yet. They haven't caught up to it yet. 14 years ago, our world was changed forever. Welcome to 13 AB.
All right. I love you guys. That's it. That's a wrap. First show of the year 2023. This is going to be a great year. You've been listening to Cafe Bitcoin, the place for your morning news, preferred hangout for some of the smartest minds in the industry. We do talk about Bitcoin every single day. Here live on Twitter Spaces, start at 7 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern, roll for 2 hours. If you can't catch it live, it is also a podcast. Up on Fountain, Spotify, and Apple. You can throw me or Swan a follow to be notified of when those drop. Thanks to Swan Bitcoin, the sponsor of this show, my crew, and your Sats for Life producer, Jacob. I'm your host, Alex Danzik, and I work for Swan Bitcoin. If you want to know more about Swan Shoe Media, I'm happy to help you. Thanks, guys. All the regular crew. Really appreciate you guys. Do love hanging out with you. All the speakers that come in here in the regular, I appreciate all of you for what you do. Time you spend to teach people about this bright orange future. This is what we call getting on the mission, folks. Let's hit it. 2023. You know what to do. If you're not figured out about Bitcoin yet, just hang out. Right? You got to pass for now. But for those of you who know what I'm talking about, you hear the sound of my voice. You know what to do, man. Let's go. Love all you guys. Everybody have a great day. Go out there and crush it. And no shitcoin. Super bad for you.
I'm not giving anybody a pass. If you're in this room and you haven't bought Bitcoin yet, you're fucking stupid.